"Excuse me, this is a library." Head librarian Margaret Thornton's voice cut sharply across the reading room as she marched toward the young black man who seemed to be talking to himself near the computer terminals. "You need to be quiet, or leave." Devon Carter looked up in confusion, his textbook still open, unaware that his quiet lip-reading practice had been mistaken for disruptive behavior. But what the librarian didn't know was that this loud student was deaf, and her assumption was about to become a lesson in disability awareness that would change everything. The Harold Washington Library Center stood as a monument to learning in downtown Chicago, its imposing neoclassical facade promising knowledge and quiet contemplation to all who entered. Inside, soaring ceilings created cathedral-like spaces where whispered conversations echoed like prayers, and the soft rustle of turning pages provided a soundtrack to scholarly pursuit. For most visitors, the library represented the perfect environment for study and research. For Devon Carter, it represented something more complex, a space where his invisible disability could suddenly become visible in ways he couldn't control. At 19, Devon had been profoundly deaf since birth, the result of a genetic condition that had affected his inner ear development. But unlike the stereotypical image many people held of deaf individuals, Devon didn't use sign language as his primary communication method. Through years of intensive speech therapy, lip-reading instruction, and the careful use of hearing aids that provided some limited auditory input, he'd learned to navigate a predominantly hearing world with remarkable skill. Devon was a junior at Northwestern University, majoring in biology with plans to attend medical school. His academic record was exemplary: a 3.9 GPA, research experience in neurology labs, and volunteer work at local hospitals, where his unique perspective on disability had made him a valuable advocate for patients with communication challenges. He'd chosen medicine precisely because he understood what it felt like to be misunderstood by healthcare providers, to have your intelligence questioned because of assumptions about your abilities. The Harold Washington Library had become Devon's preferred study location during winter break. The university libraries were closed, and the downtown location offered both the resources he needed for his MCAT preparation and the kind of focused environment that helped him concentrate. What many people didn't understand about deaf individuals was that libraries weren't automatically peaceful spaces for them. Without the ability to hear ambient noise levels, it was easy to accidentally make sounds that others found disruptive. Devon had developed strategies to manage this challenge. He chose seats away from other patrons when possible, used visual cues to monitor his environment, and had learned to modulate his voice based on the reactions of people around him. But there was one activity that sometimes drew unwanted attention: his lip-reading practice. As a pre-med student, Devon knew that his success in medical school and his future career would depend partly on his ability to communicate effectively with patients, professors, and colleagues. While his lip-reading skills were already advanced, he continued to practice regularly, especially before important events like medical school interviews. This practice involved silently mouthing words and phrases, working through complex medical terminology, and rehearsing conversations he might need to navigate in professional settings. To most observers, this practice was invisible, just a student moving his lips slightly while reading. But to someone watching closely, especially someone who didn't understand what they were seeing, it could appear that Devon was talking to himself or being disruptive in a quiet environment. Margaret Thornton had been the head librarian at Harold Washington for 15 years, a position she'd earned through a combination of library science expertise, administrative skill, and an unwavering commitment to what she called traditional library values. At 50, she'd witnessed the transformation of libraries from quiet repositories of books to multimedia learning centers. And while she'd adapted to technological changes, she remained firmly committed to maintaining standards of behavior that she believed were essential to the library's mission. Thornton prided herself on running a tight ship. She knew the names of regular patrons, could spot potential problems before they escalated, and had developed a reputation for fairly but firmly enforcing library policies. In her view, the library served everyone best when it maintained an atmosphere conducive to serious study and research. Disruptive behavior, regardless of the patron's age, background, or apparent intentions, was something she addressed quickly and decisively. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Thornton had noticed Devon during her regular rounds through the reading areas. She'd seen him several times over the past week, always sitting alone, always with medical textbooks and notes spread around him. He seemed like a serious student, the kind of patron she appreciated. But today, something was different. As she walked past his table, she noticed that he appeared to be talking, not loudly, but in a way that seemed inconsistent with library etiquette. Thornton paused at a nearby shelf, pretending to organize books while observing Devon more closely. She could see his lips moving, could detect what appeared to be vocalization, and she noticed that other patrons were beginning to glance in his direction. In her experience, this kind of behavior typically escalated if not addressed promptly. Students who talked to themselves often became more disruptive over time, and she'd learned that early intervention was usually the most effective approach. What Thornton couldn't see, what she had no way of knowing, was that Devon wasn't talking at all. He was practicing lip reading by silently mouthing medical terminology he'd been studying, a technique his speech therapist had taught him years earlier. The slight movements of his lips and the occasional barely audible breath were simply the physical mechanics of this practice, not an attempt to vocalize or communicate with anyone. After watching for several minutes, Thornton decided to act. She approached Devon's table with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, her expression serious but not unkind. In her mind, this was a routine interaction, a gentle correction that would resolve the issue and allow everyone to return to their study. "Excuse me," she said, standing directly in front of Devon's table, "you need to keep your voice down. This is a quiet study area." Devon looked up from his textbook, clearly startled by the sudden presence of the librarian. He hadn't heard her approach, couldn't have heard her approach, and the sudden appearance of an authority figure standing over him triggered the kind of anxiety that many deaf individuals experienced when they realized they'd missed important auditory cues. "I'm sorry," Devon said, his voice carefully modulated in the way he'd been trained since childhood. "Was I being too loud?" The question seemed reasonable enough, but to Thornton, it felt disingenuous. She'd been watching him for several minutes, had clearly seen him talking, and his apparent confusion struck her as an attempt to avoid responsibility for his behavior. "Yes, you were talking," she said, her tone becoming more authoritative. "Other patrons are trying to study, and your conversation is disruptive." Devon's confusion deepened. "Conversation? I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm studying alone." Thornton's patience began to wear thin. In her experience, students who argued with library staff were usually testing boundaries, seeing how much disruptive behavior they could get away with. The fact that this young man was denying what she'd clearly observed suggested that this interaction might require a firmer approach. "I watched you talking for several minutes," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I could see your lips moving, and I could hear vocalization. If you can't study quietly, you'll need to find somewhere else to work." The accusation hit Devon like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire life working to fit into hearing environments, had developed extraordinary skills to communicate effectively despite his disability, and had learned to advocate for himself in situations where his needs weren't understood. But this accusation, that he was being disruptive, that he was lying about his behavior, that he didn't belong in this space, touched on some of his deepest fears about how others perceived him. "Ma'am," Devon said, his voice remaining calm despite the frustration building inside him, "I think you're misunderstanding what you saw. I wasn't talking to anyone. I was practicing lip reading." Thornton's expression hardened. The explanation sounded like an excuse, a creative attempt to justify inappropriate behavior. In her 15 years as head librarian, she'd heard countless creative explanations from students trying to avoid consequences for breaking library rules. "Lip reading?" she said, her tone skeptical. "That's quite convenient. Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but I know what I saw. You were talking, and when I asked you to stop, you started making up stories." The word stories landed like a slap. Devon felt his face flush with a combination of embarrassment and anger. Around him, other patrons had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, and he could see in their faces the same assumption that Thornton was making, that he was a disruptive student trying to talk his way out of trouble. "I'm not making up stories," Devon said, his voice remaining steady, despite the emotion building inside him. "I'm deaf. I was practicing lip reading because I have medical school interviews coming up. I wasn't talking to anyone because I can't hear anyone to talk to." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just been lit. Thornton stared at Devon, processing what he'd just said, trying to reconcile this information with what she thought she'd observed. Around them, the reading room had gone completely quiet, with dozens of patrons now openly watching the interaction unfold. "You're deaf?" Thornton said, her voice smaller than it had been moments before. "Profoundly deaf since birth," Devon confirmed. "I wear hearing aids that provide some limited input, but I rely primarily on lip reading for communication. What you saw wasn't me talking. It was me practicing medical terminology by mouthing words silently." Thornton felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. In 15 years of library work, she'd prided herself on her ability to read situations accurately, to understand patron needs, and to treat everyone fairly. The possibility that she'd completely misinterpreted Devon's behavior, that she'd publicly confronted and humiliated a disabled student for practicing skills related to his disability, was almost too painful to acknowledge. I didn't know," she stammered, her authoritative demeanor crumbling. "You speak so well, I never would have guessed." "That I'm deaf?" Devon finished. "That's actually the point. I've spent 19 years learning to communicate effectively in a hearing world. Most people don't realize I'm deaf unless I tell them, which is usually the goal." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Devon's success in adapting to hearing environments had made his disability invisible, but that invisibility had also made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of misunderstanding they'd just experienced. Thornton looked around the reading room, suddenly aware of the dozens of people watching their interaction. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable, and a few appeared to be filming the confrontation with their phones. The realization that her mistake was being documented for potential social media distribution added another layer of anxiety to an already difficult situation. "Mr.?" she began, hoping to at least learn his name and begin the process of making amends. "Carter. Devon Carter." "Miss Carter, I owe you a sincere apology. I completely misunderstood the situation, and I'm deeply sorry for the way I spoke to you." Devon studied her face, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. His anger was still present, but it was tempered by his understanding of how easily these misunderstandings could occur. He'd experienced similar situations before: teachers who thought he was ignoring them, employers who questioned his abilities, healthcare providers who spoke to his interpreters instead of directly to him. "I appreciate the apology," Devon said, "but this isn't really about me. It's about assumptions and the way disabled people are treated when their disabilities aren't obvious." Thornton nodded, beginning to understand the broader implications of what had just happened. "What can I do to make this right?" "You can learn," Devon said simply, "and you can make sure your staff understands that not all disabilities are visible, and that behavior that seems disruptive might actually be someone practicing skills they need to succeed." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Devon explained the basics of deaf culture, the challenges faced by people with invisible disabilities, and the importance of asking questions before making assumptions. Thornton listened with the attention of someone who'd realized that her expertise in library science hadn't prepared her for the full range of human experiences represented by her patrons. Other library users, initially drawn by the confrontation, found themselves staying to listen as Devon shared his experiences navigating educational institutions, the workplace, and social situations as a deaf person. Several admitted that they'd made similar assumptions about people with disabilities, and a few shared their own experiences as family members or friends of disabled individuals. The incident could have ended there, with a personal apology and a private learning experience. But Devon realized that this was an opportunity to create broader change. He asked Thornton if she'd be willing to arrange disability awareness training for library staff, not as punishment for her mistake, but as a way to ensure that other disabled patrons wouldn't face similar misunderstanding. Thornton agreed immediately. Within a month, the Harold Washington Library had implemented comprehensive accessibility training for all staff members. The program covered not just physical accessibility requirements, but also communication strategies for working with patrons who had various types of disabilities. Devon volunteered to speak at the first training session, sharing his story and helping staff understand the patron perspective on accessibility. The training program became a model for other library systems across the country. Videos of Devon's presentation were shared through library professional networks, and his story became a case study in disability awareness training program. The irony that a confrontation in a library had led to improved access to information and resources wasn't lost on Devon, who saw it as validation of his decision to speak up rather than simply accepting the apology and moving on. 6 months later, Devon received his acceptance letter to Northwestern University's medical school. His personal statement had focused on his experiences as a deaf person navigating healthcare systems and his commitment to improving communication between medical professionals and patients with disability. The admissions committee had been particularly impressed by his description of the library incident and how he'd turned a negative experience into an opportunity for education and advocacy. Margaret Thornton attended Devon's medical school graduation 4 years later. She'd followed his progress through university publications and had maintained contact with him as he worked with the library system to continue improving accessibility. In her remarks at the accessibility training sessions she now led regularly, she always included Devon's story as an example of how assumptions could hurt the very people libraries were meant to serve. The reading room where their confrontation had occurred now featured a small plaque near the entrance. This library serves patrons of all abilities. If you need assistance understanding how someone else's disability affects their library use, please ask a staff member. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it represented a commitment to ensuring that future Devons would find understanding rather than assumptions when they came to study. Devon's story became more than just an anecdote about disability awareness. It became a reminder that expertise in one area, library science, in Thornton's case, didn't automatically translate to understanding of human diversity. It highlighted the difference between accommodation and inclusion, between following disability laws and truly creating welcoming spaces for disabled people. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the most effective advocacy often came not from anger or confrontation, but from patient education and the willingness to turn negative experiences into opportunities for positive change. Devon's decision to work with Thornton, rather than simply accepting her apology, had created ripple effects that benefited countless other disabled individuals who would use library services in the future. Years later, when Devon was practicing medicine as a resident in pediatric neurology, he would encounter similar situations with patients whose disabilities weren't immediately apparent. His experience in the library had taught him the importance of asking questions rather than making assumptions, of listening to patient explanations rather than relying solely on observable behaviors, and of understanding that expertise in medicine didn't automatically confer understanding of the disabled experience. The lesson that began with a misunderstanding about lip-reading practice had evolved into a career-long commitment to improving healthcare for disabled patients. And somewhere in Chicago, in a library reading room where assumptions had once created conflict, students with invisible disabilities continued to study and learn, supported by staff who understood that not all struggles were visible, and that true accommodation required more than just following rules. It required understanding the human beings those rules were meant to serve.